Welcome back, everybody, to We Belong Here, our series at Advanced Native Political Leadership, where we talk with leaders throughout Indian country on topics and work building political power. That includes educating our public on positions that impact our lives. This week, we saw hearings for the nominee to be the Secretary of the Department of Interior. Perhaps the first time this position drew an incredible audience from major media and the general public. For the first time in 244 years, the nominee is an Indigenous woman. Congresswoman Deb Haaland is making history with her nomination, and people are paying attention, especially across Indian country. Before we introduce our guests, let me tell you more about the Department of Interior. Most people know that the Department of Interior manages public lands, but how much public lands? 500 million acres of public lands. That's more than Texas, California, Montana, and New Mexico combined. The Department of Interior employs 70,000 people. They're pretty big operation. The agency's 2020 budget was $12.6 billion, with another $9.6 billion for specific activities outside the annual appropriation. The agencies designates endangered species such as polar bears while opening their habitat to mining and energy development. National parks preserve natural gas and cultural treasures while also promoting recreation and public access to them. The U.S. Geological Survey falls under the Interior, and they've been known to collaborate with NASA on space policy. The agency, which is pretty significant for Native folks, oversees the prominent departments such as the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education, while fulfilling the nation's trust responsibilities to American Indians and Alaska Natives. It's also been caught charging non-natives below market value prices for timber and grazing rights, the mismanagement managing of public lands, and losing billions in tribal funds that resulted in a lawsuit, which we might talk about a little bit later. And thanks to Indian Country Today, you can read more about the Department of Interior and Congresswoman Deb Haaland and this historic nomination and political process. And I want to introduce our guest today. Joining us is the editor of Indian Country Today, Mr. Mark Trahant, who is an asset across Indian country, both for his political insight into the landscape across Indian country, but just being an in-depth journalist and having his perspective with us today is a real treat. Let me introduce him. Mark is a member of Idaho's Shoshone-Bannock tribe and former president of the Native American Journalists Association. Mr. Trahant was appointed to lead Indian Country Today as a digital enterprise in March of 2018, saying, "We have so many stories to tell. Our mission is simple but important. Solid, factual reporting, great writing, photography that inspires and records, provide a real service to readers across Indian country's digital landscape." And Mark was recently elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Formerly, he was a professor at the University of North Dakota and the University of Alaska Anchorage. He has also taught at the University of Idaho and the University of Colorado. Trahant reports and comments on events and trends on Facebook. You can follow him on Twitter at Trahant Reports and other social media. He does a weekly audio commentary for Native Voice One. And Mark, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Prairie. I was glad to be here.
So, tell us about your thoughts about this week's hearings with Deb Haaland and her nomination.
Well, it's hard to escape the history. The idea that somebody who was once completely under the thumb of the secretary, who could decide really life and death issues, and to suddenly think there's the person going to be calling the shots. That's a really big deal. It's also, I think the bigger picture is that there's a real tension going on between those who want to do business the way it's been done, where basically economics and oil and gas be the primary framework for how decisions are made about public lands, or even how we use every resource. And now the framework is going to be climate and science, and it's going to shift the balance. And that goes beyond Deb Haaland to across the government, as the Biden administration is saying we want climate change to be the first metric we use to look at complicated issues. That changes everything. You saw in the hearing just so much tension from particularly Western senators who liked it with oil and gas running things, or coal. and even grizzly bear extinction. And suddenly they're getting there's a new sheriff in town.
Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty incredible, some of the questioning along the lines of like first acknowledging that she's a Native American woman, she's an Indigenous woman, and then how do you feel about pipelines? How do you feel about climate, right? And I think they forget the leverage of tribal sovereignty across the public lands of the United States and our relationship to public lands. And all of a sudden, they have to pay attention now too. Like all of a sudden, you're right, there's a new sheriff in town. And we're looking at these secretaries and that historical element, 53 secretaries of the Department of Interior, every one of them white. And for the first time in American history, we have an Indigenous woman, Deb Haaland of Laguna Pueblo. And Mark, you've been watching Deb from being a candidate in New Mexico, a candidate for Congress, and now a nomination to the Secretary of Interior. What does this mean for the American people?
Well, here's one meaning. The first time I met Deb Haaland was at the AFN convention, Alaska Federation of Natives, in Anchorage 6 years ago. She was running for lieutenant governor of New Mexico. She lost that race, and here she is 6 years later, Secretary of the Interior, about to be. And that really, to me, shows that, well, there's so much to that story. Part of it was her talent. Part of it was her working. I mean, she started off as an organizer, so she did the really basic stuff that's not really glamorous. And one story that's really a part of that, and you saw it, I loved a tweet from Sharice Davids. She said, "Do you have a shawl I can borrow?" And that is this incredible network of women who have watched each other and worked with each other and have made sure that they were going to be successful together. So I think we're going to see things happen. It's not just going to be about Deb, but what's going to happen on a broader, and you're already seeing it with appointments in the solicitor's office and other places where you're going to see Native people running the national parks. You're going to see people running the Bureau of Land Management. One of the most exciting ones came about yesterday, and that is Jamie Pinkham, who is a former tribal council member at Nez Perce and a foundation executive, was appointed as an assistant secretary of the Army, and he's now in charge of the Corps of Engineer. And you think about all the permits that go through the Corps of Engineer, all the dams that go through the Corps of Engineer, and all the salmon mitigation. And here's someone who grew up in the Northwest caring more about salmon than most people ever know. And he is now going to be the one deciding which permits get signed off on.
Oh, that's incredible news. I love Jamie Pinkham. He and I got to know each other through the Bush Foundation and our Rebuilders work, and talking about tribal sovereignty and really putting out these pillars of, we don't have to hide behind tribal sovereignty. We can leverage this. We have autonomy. We can bring back, and rematriate the Nez Perce horse. We can bring back the salmon. We can bring back these pieces of who we are and our identity in a way that lifts up our values. And that's exciting. You just totally broke news to me. I had no idea. And all the things I was paying attention to this week, I missed Jamie Pinkham and his appointment. That's incredible. I'm going to have to send him a text message. We have some inside jokes, and I'm ready to share those with him again.
Well, we have it on the newscast tonight, so you can watch it in North Dakota. And then it'll be in our digital platform, a longer story we're working on as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, though. We're seeing an incredibly diverse, slate of appointments across the country. I think this is probably one of the most diverse slate of appointments that I've ever seen, and I think that's just a real testament to movement and front lines and organizers stepping up for what really matters, and making a claim to say, hey, we deserve to protect this, and we deserve to be in these positions. And we're seeing a lot of incredible folks who were organizers, were land defenders, water protectors, being in appointments now across the administration, not just the Department of Interior and but Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, right? We're seeing Department of Defense. Like, we're seeing a ton of appointments, which is pretty incredible to see.
Well, and one part of it, and I think the language of the testimony is really important, is that we're starting to see, so this is kind of both ends of the spectrum. on one hand, tribal sovereignty and tribal communities are getting a new voice. But on the other hand, there's also a new sense of globalism. And that globalism is saying things like, you know what, if we're going to be in the United Nations, we got to take seriously the United Nations declarations of the rights of indigenous people. And it outlines a process with free, prior, informed consent.
Mhm.
That's a very basic thing.
Yeah.
And to suddenly have some of these governors and senators have to listen to that, and it must drive them nuts, where they're going to have to know that that is a standard that is going to apply.
Yeah, well, and that's one way tribal nations have leveraged their sovereignty is to engage and initiate that process of free, prior informed consent, because FPIC is something that's not been a significant part of the administrative process and procedures when encroaching on not just public lands but tribal lands, it's an issue. That's why we're winning in the courts on in public spaces, because of the violations of administrative procedures, and that idea of consent and engaging people when you're either telling our story or want to build a pipeline through our lands. I mean, it's pretty incredible statement to bring something that hasn't been spoken about domestically, but has become common practice in the international arena of working with Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I have another question, kind of similar to speaking about the diversity of all the political appointments, but with American Indians, Indigenous people, Black and Brown peoples in the United States, representation really has mattered and made a difference. And beyond that, identity politics has played a significant role in both supporting Deb Haaland's nomination as well in her opposition. We've seen that even in the questioning that she received this weekend during her hearings. But speaking about the Secretary of the Department of Interior, what kind of qualities do we need in this type of role?
Well, you have to be really adept to be a Secretary of the Interior. It may be one of the most complicated jobs in government. You have to keep happy the cattle industry, the oil and gas industry, recreation and parks, and of course the Indians. So it is not going to be an easy task. I think one of the challenges for Indian country is to make sure that we give her enough support so that expectations are not too high. There are things she cannot do. She cannot return land. There are things that require legislation. And to suddenly put on her the last 200 and plus years is really unfair. She's going to make a lot of progress. And I think we need to celebrate all those steps that happen along the way. But to expect everything to magically change after she's sworn in is unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. This role is pretty complicated and has brought so much attention just in the last few weeks, couple months actually, of her being announced as the nominee. People are starting to pay attention, and they had no idea that Indigenous people were within the Department of Interior. I mean, we went. That was I don't even know the year when we went from the Department of War to the Department of Interior. The same with
1849.
Thank you. Thank you. I knew you'd know that.
1955 was the Indian Health Service transfer.
Yeah. It's it blows people's minds away when they realize that as Indigenous people, we're branded in a way. You think of our enrollment numbers, you think of our blood quantum and all of the issues related to blood quantum and descendancy, and here we are in with agriculture who's also branding and taking care of those bloodlines and making sure that there's purity standards, this colonial perspective of our identity, and we're still fighting for our existence.
Well, and hopefully, I mean, and I've talked to several folks who are both into agriculture and interior. There really, at some point, has to be a reckoning. We've got to look through and think, is this really the way to organize a government? And a good example of that is the US Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management do exactly the same thing. The only difference is where they're located. And yet one reports to the Secretary of Agriculture and the other reports to the Secretary of Interior. At some point, we're going to say, let's figure out what's the best way to manage these public lands in a way that's most efficient. and most useful for the long term. And we're still not having that conversation. Um, one of the if you just look at it from where tribal governments fit into the world, we probably should be in the State Department. That would be the most logical in terms of dealing with nation to nation issues. Um, but for whatever reason, it's been the interior. There's a great story from Vine Deloria about attempt to move out interior, and they were saying we should be somewhere else. And the Nixon administration actually wanted to do that, and the Johnson administration wanted to do that. And Vine told the story about this tribal leader who went in and said, well, if we go to Department of wherever, will we still have direct relations with the government? Yes. Will we still have appointments doing this, this, and this? Yes. Will we still doing all that? He says, then why move us? At least we know where the doors are.
Yeah. Yeah. I value that, though, where our trust responsibility and our trust relationship as tribal nations is with the federal government, right?
Yeah.
And we've been left out of state procedures for such a long time because they felt we were a federal issue to be dealt with, and that has led to so much dysfunction in our own local systems and relationships. And I mean, I live in a place where our border towns still have this mentality that, if you see an Indian, shoot them because they don't want you here. Most likely, you don't want them here because we still have inherited that effect of colonization and genocide and the taking of lands, and that's still very recent, even in my own family's history. I mean, the Garrison Dam was 1953, and it removed 90% of our people, relocated us to the higher grounds, where we then became dependent on rations, and our relationship was never with the state, right? Like, the state could have done so much in terms of our quality of life, but we were a federal problem to be dealt with. And that's fairly recent. That's my dad's lifetime. That's, I inherited being pissed off about the damming of our people and the stealing of our bottomlands. And so are farmers in this area too. But that relationship with the state is still complicated. With the federal government, it's still complicated.
Yeah. And now Jamie Pinkham will be in charge of projects like Garrison Dam.
I'm gonna call him. Yeah, that's pretty incredible. I just, yeah, I feel, and I also, like, Indian country is so small that I know a handful of people who've now been appointed into these incredible positions, and I'm just so proud that all of a sudden this government is starting to look more like the way our communities look, and there's somebody there not just to be the in-between, to apologize on behalf of the government, but to actually work with us and build relationships with us. So I'm really excited about that.
On your other point about all aspects of the government, this is one that I have a big project I've been working on forever about Medicaid. And we've forever talked about fully funding the Indian health system and what it would take. And one of the ways that Indian health can be fully funded is Medicaid. And states have actually been an obstacle in one sense. So there's now a discussion about what if we could lift the Indian health system part of Medicaid out of the state structure and actually have it be its own or deal directly with Washington. And how much more effective could you be if tribes could say, you're eligible, you're eligible, you're eligible, rather than waiting for people in Bismarck to make that decision.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty powerful statement, and that the autonomy that tribes have to do something like that. We're seeing something, out here, and actually within this region, I'm seeing other tribes do this. We saw higher rates of vaccinations happening during the pandemic here as vaccines became available, and now we're opening it up to non-natives who live within our borders, and there's a lot here where I am, and that's just something that is about building relationships, and the tribe was able to make that decision. And there's people upset about that. There's people upset saying, well, why are they getting this? Well, we're dying. I think about the smallpox epidemic in the 1800s for our tribe, and they stopped at South Dakota. They stopped the inoculations in South Dakota. They didn't have the federal monies to come into North Dakota. And I think about uh, the amount of our people who would still be alive if we were not ravaged by the smallpox epidemic, if we had been inoculated, right? But the doctors stopped the program, and in some cases used dirty needles because they didn't have the knowledge about sterilization back then, so people were getting sick and dying because of an infection related to dirty needles. It's a whole nother story now, where our people are dying and we're being inoculated, and now there's people who are upset that we're vaccinated before they are. Well, we're opening up our borders now so that you too can also be vaccinated.
Yeah, and that's a story across Indian country. The vaccination success story is just extraordinary, and it's from Alaska to really across the board.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, because we all have the same trauma from, previous epidemics. It's nice to be a priority for
Yeah.
once, for once. But anyway,
And
back to
more important, it's not just the priority, but also a system. So
yes,
most of the general healthcare people know their doctor, but they don't know how it fits together. So they don't even know who to call to get a vaccine. Whereas folks in the Indian health system already have a routine. And
hmm
that's really, it shows how important a system approach to healthcare is, because IHS knew what to do
yep,
and tribal hospitals knew what to do. This is shows the strength of our system.
yeah. So fund it, so fund the system.
Absolutely.
Well, back to my line of questioning, Mark. The Department of Interior, they don't have the best track record at managing public lands. And we mentioned this just briefly a second ago. They don't have the best track record of managing public lands or tribal lands, resulting in lawsuits like Cobell versus Salazar, which targeted both the Department of Interior and the Department of Treasury for mismanagement of Indian trust funds. That was settled in 2009. So I know this question might be controversial, but given the history, natives might be under the impression that if confirmed, Secretary Haaland would be able to give the land back. And you spoke to this earlier, but what would you tell the public about bureaucracy and administration to help mitigate some of the pressure, if confirmed, Secretary Haaland might get from Native folks to in the land back movement?
It's so complicated, partly because of colonialism. I actually have on my desk um, a letter from a superintendent on 3/4 of, no, 0.34 acres that I own. And if I don't sign the lease by or the end of the month, so it's too late, the superintendent's going to sign it for me.
Yep.
And it just shows that how convoluted this whole thing is, and how it needs to be reformed. But once you start talking about reform, it means not everybody can manage the lands that are that small. And how do you consolidate it in a way that's fair to everybody? And that just, you start opening it up and it gets really messy really fast. I think what we can say is that Secretary Haaland will make sure that everybody's voice is heard. So even if a decision doesn't go your way, at least you'll be at the table, where in the past that's just not been the case.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's funny you have a letter. I have a very similar one right here.
It's that time of year.
That time of year where yeah, I probably missed the deadline on here too, but my ownership of this is not very significant at all. My my partner and I tease each other about being mineral rich. Natives were not at all, because our stake in the airship, remember, they flooded 90% of our land base, so what was left over then got split up between the survivors. So it's a very complicated issue about landship and how they've broken up our lands.
I actually have an oil well and I get in the high two figures.
Oh, like 23 cents or
No, $23.
oh, 23. Wow. Wow. Big spender.
Yeah, it's a lunch.
Yeah, for real, for real. But yeah, I think, getting back to the line of question, like, I think that's right. We have to support, Secretary Haaland, if confirmed, around those issues of the bureaucracy, because our folks, we know to be pissed off, right? But we might not know the process and the procedures in which work gets done. We're seeing a lot of states, I shouldn't say a lot of, it'd be nice to see a lot of states giving land back. Minnesota just gave, you know, tribal lands back to, I think, the lower Sioux or upper Sioux community in Minnesota. And I've seen, other areas where lands being given back, and some religious denominations also giving land back to local communities, and what that process is. But it's a lot easier to do when land is held privately and you can give it back to tribes versus a state or a federal government being able to give land back.
I think there will be some land back though, and I think there will also be, and maybe even more significant, big tracts of land that will suddenly go into co-management, where the federal government will have a role, but tribal governments will say, "Here's how we want to run it," and the federal government will say, "We're out of here. Do it the way you want to do it." You're already seeing it with the Bison Range in Montana, with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. But I think you'll see more of those kind of projects throughout the West.
Yeah, the Salish Kootenai tribe, their bison management program. I mean, that's a pretty unique one because I don't know if you know their story. You probably know their story. You know how they saved all these orphan bison calves, and like walked them through the Rockies into Montana and created this preserve to save the bison. And then this shady deal that went down, and then all of a sudden, they're federal property.
Right.
And see that relationship, being fostered and encouraged where there's this co-management is really beautiful. And I agree. I think we will see more of that. And I also think you will see more of what the Salish Kootenai tribe is doing. I mean, they bought their local dam, they own that now. And, what do you do with such a big piece of infrastructure that had all this investment and now it's tribally owned? So it'll be interesting to see tribes kind of buying these bigger pieces of infrastructure back. I know our tribe has bought land or is leasing land so that we can bring bison back and have different programs being operated. But I mean, imagine owning all of a sudden the dam. If we
Yeah.
were a Western tribe, I'm sure we'd probably deconstruct that so the salmon come back, right? But here in the Midwest and the Great Plains, it's a different story. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen with both that type of management, but also tribes securing resources like that as well.
Exactly. And you're right. I mean, just the idea of deconstruction of dams is suddenly going to move back up on the agenda. One of the scary things from the past 4 years, and it didn't happen, but I really thought it would, is the first choice for Interior Secretary was a congresswoman from Washington State, and Kathy McMorris Rogers. And she actually talked about invoking the God Squad. And the God Squad is a really weird provision of federal law that says the Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, and I think it's the Secretary of Treasury can get together and declare a species extinct. And she wanted to do that for Pacific Northwest salmon. And her idea was to protect the barge routes in the Northwest. Had that happened, we wouldn't have you've been able to use the Environmental Endangered Species Act to bring back salmon. I mean, it really would have changed everything had she done that. And fortunately, she didn't get the job, and she didn't ever get to that conclusion.
Dang. People, your votes matter. Your votes matter, and all of these layers that affect our lives and our ecosystems and that we live in. Incredible. Incredible. Well, our time is kind of sneaking up on us here. In a similar vein to that last question, the Department of Interior was working to get some oil and gas lease sales in wildlife in a wildlife refuge, wrapped up before the Biden administration could get to work. When it comes to these types of positions, we've already talked about how complicated it is, but I imagine there's going to be issues that conflict with one another. And in your experience, Mark, what's the best pathway forward here with the public? How can we educate the public as well as organize to protect the sacred? Is there some space where frontline movements and policy can intersect here?
I do, and I think the secretary designate really hit that in her testimony the other day, where she talked about, yeah, we can talk about the loss of jobs in extractive industries, but let's talk about the jobs that are growing. and to start to talk to communities. I remember driving across Wyoming and seeing these jobs brought to you by coal. And yeah, that's true. But now, what about the jobs that are being created from other industries? And can that really benefit rural communities in a way that hasn't been before? And I think that's one message that could resonate throughout the region.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I we need to start creating some self viability and thinking of this vision. We've been talking about it for so long, and now we just need to make those steps happen. And I think many tribes are on the front lines of doing that, protecting the sacred, initiating a new infrastructure that is greener, that can be implemented in outside of tribal spaces. But we need the investment. We need the buy-in from the federal government, from the states. How do we move away from capitalism if that's all we know? It's pretty deep in how we are all embedded into these systems, dependent on extractive industry and extractive resources, but at the same time wanting to protect our water, wanting to protect our lands. We're seeing farmlands not being nutrient rich anymore because they've gotten away from practices that put nutrients back in the soil, right? Like these are practices indigenous permaculture has known for a very long time, and now we're starting to see, oh, maybe fire and conservation can work together. Like how do we how do we bring these practices back to the mainstream? We have to show people that they work in a bigger way.
Well, one part of that, I think, is we need to start challenging the myth of capitalism. When people ask about capitalism, I often say it's a good idea. Someone might try it one day. You look at projects like Dakota Access, they are the most socialist programs you could think about. There's so much subsidy going into it. It would never pencil out if it was a capitalist project.
Hmm.
And that kind of rigor needs to apply across the board. They've always made that kind of rigor part of our argument, but they haven't any kind of social program. They'll say, we got to take a pencil to it. But when it comes to big extractive industries, they haven't given that same sort of rigor. And now I think they're going to see that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're starting to see that all over the place. I mean, even in the healthcare system, where we're getting a profit of $40 billion in the healthcare industry going to the executives of insurance companies, right? Like
Right.
we're seeing subsidies going to these insurance companies during a pandemic when they're providing care. That care can just be paid for. I mean, already move to a universal healthcare system, because we're already seeing that being played out with our government paying for all of these subsidies.
And
All of
there's no country anywhere on this planet that has a private sector healthcare system.
no,
And the reason for that is what's an empty bed worth? The
yeah,
goal is an empty bed, and it's worth nothing.
yeah, yeah. It took a pandemic though for people to realize uh, the value of that. The MHA Nation, I think it was today, flew our flags at half mast because the numbers are over 500,000 lost to the pandemic, and the reality that we've created all of these communities of care within our own communities to ensure safety and mitigate risk. Um, that's a model to value and to believe in, because we're losing so many, but to honor those lives lost, because there's such a culture of dismissing that great a loss. I mean, I don't remember, they said so many wars combined, we haven't had that many individuals lost. I mean, it's significant in the United States.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. Well, we are coming up on our time mark, pretty close here, but I want to give you an opportunity to share your thoughts in this moment to educate the larger public on if confirmed Secretary Haaland's role in the Department of Interior and Indigenous communities. I mean, you're such a wealth of knowledge. I mean, I could listen to you like just all day, just rattle off all kinds of stuff. I should take your class. But the there's so many layers to this, and these systems that have left us out by design. And here, all of a sudden, we have the opportunity to be at the helm of the decision-making body as well as the process. And that can have a huge impact for not just Indigenous people in communities, but the larger American public. So I want to give you some space to just lay down the knowledge.
Sure. Well, and this goes really to the work that Advanced Native Political Leadership does in trying to encourage people to run and participate in the system. It can be said, and people could throw up their hands and say, this is not our system. It's never going to work for us. And of course, that's all true. But the fact remains that we now have a Native woman who is sixth or seventh in line for the presidency, that when the next State of the Union occurs, she will be on the list as a potential designated survivor. Um, that's really extraordinary when you think about it, that not only are we in a position of making decisions that affect our lives, but that the entire country will have to look to Indigenous knowledge as a part of the process. And I think that's only going to get stronger. I mean, really, we're looking across the board, and now you're looking at folks who are so close to being in the next tier of leadership, whether it's Sharice Davids continuing her work in the House, or Peggy Flanagan. When does she run for governor? When does she run for another office? There's only really strong possibilities. The number of people running, I mean, this last week or 2 weeks ago, having Representative Nygren get appointed in Arizona. She's 25 years old, and she's going to know the Arizona legislature better than everyone by the time she's 30. What committees is she going to be on when she's 35? What Senate role? Arizona 1st Congressional District is the most Native district in the country, and there's never been somebody in the general election to represent the tribal voice. How long are we from that happening? And I think it's going to be sooner than we think. As small as our population is, it has the potential to pack a punch. And we've seen that in time after time when folks get motivated, and this last election was one of them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. We're seeing the political landscape change because we're getting involved, and thank you for bringing up Advanced Native Political Leadership, because we are, an organization that has a mission to recruit and train Native leaders to run for elected office. And we'll put that link in the chat box on our session here, where folks, we're trying to recruit 100 folks within 100 days. We might have hit that number, but go above and beyond, right? How do we get more Native leaders equipped to run for office and be at those decision-making bodies? We're really excited about that. And I think you're right. We have the first lieutenant governor, we have the first, senators, and if confirmed, the first secretary of state, or secretary of interior, Department of Interior. But the wave that has started since 2018 and before, but now moving in such incredible lengths to see ourselves in these positions of power. These systems affect our lives. And I do know some of those folks who are like, I'm never going to vote. I'm never going to get involved. And that's okay, because we're building leadership and we're building political power one person at a time. And I'm excited about that work.
It's very important. And you look at states like Kansas, and one of the measures used to be parity. Are we making having representation in the legislature equal to our population? Kansas blew past that. They're not even close to that. They've got more power than the population, and that is so cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I want to see that across the country, though. We're getting there. We're getting there. We're building reflective government. We got to get involved. And I'm so excited about the young people. They have so much more awareness about civic engagement and what our, that unspoken contract of what citizenship should be in this country. And I think it's because of all of these, dysfunctions that we've been seeing, the immigration, children locked in cages, well, what is that system? And our young people are doing their own research and saying, this needs to change. This needs to stop. This is unacceptable, right? So I feel in my old age, when I get there, hopefully a long time from now, that we'll be taken care of. And there's so much hope in those who are running now and those who want to run. So if you want to run, find our link and sign up for our trainings and get involved. We're really excited about that. Mark, we greatly appreciate your time. Thanks for giving us your evening and sharing your insights. and thoughts. Thank you for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. Any final comments you want to share with us?
No, I'm delighted to do this, and I hope you either read in your country today or look at us on television.
Yeah, I encourage you to read it. That you guys become my main news source. When I Google things, I'm like, oh, I should just go to Indian Country Day because those are all the items that are coming up. I'm like, that's exactly what I need to know. I know it's biased. I know I got my own bias, but I appreciate you and your team and the work that you all have been doing to really advance not just Indigenous voices in this country, but our perspective and centering our narratives. So folks know that we are still here, and like this series is called We Belong Here, our Facebook Live series. And thank you all for joining us this one. And I hope we see you at another time. Thanks so much, everybody.